Welcome to Oh God What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. On today's show, Rishi Sunak's image screams technocratic dweeb, but do his beliefs mark him out as further to the right than Johnson or Truss? Plus, the Labour top brass doesn't seem open to Sadiq Khan's call for rent controls in the capital, but he hopes that a U-turn might be in the offing. Is the policy the answer to Generation Rent's prayers, or are Labour right to fear the unintended consequences? And in the extra bit for Patreon backers, Margaret Thatcher cooking apron, anyone? No. With conference season and its accompanying tat almost upon us, we look at the best and worst political merchandise. Let's meet the panel. Hannah Fearn is a columnist for the iPaper. Hi, Hannah.
Hi.
You would have been delighted to hear that Nick Timothy, co-author of the Tories' 2017 manifesto, one of the architects of the hostile environment and general bad take haver on the internet, has been selected as the candidate to replace Matt Hancock in West Suffolk.
Happy news.
It's a real frying pan fire situation for West Suffolk. Is this another case of failing upwards, or does Nick have very well hidden strengths?
Well, he didn't really go away. This is the thing. He lost May the 2017 general election by pushing her into a snap election, which was a bad idea. But then since then, he's been a bit of a shady backroom operator. He's been consulting for the Department for Education and then for the Home Office, where he's doing a big review into its effectiveness, which is ironic considering, as you said, he was part of the hostile environment creative team in the first place. So I personally would rather that his career is exposed to the light, that he stands and that we can follow everything he's doing clearly and we know what he is, what he's pushing for, what his job is, and that it's publicly accountable. So, not great for the people of West Suffolk, but probably better to have him out in the open.
So is this your general policy then, that right-wing wrong-uns should at least be standing for Parliament and have to do all of the kind of, all the kind of the drudge work rather than just like flitting from think tank to think tank?
Yes, definitely. There's so many people in think tanks that the general public would never have heard of. Nick Timothy, I think most voters don't know who he is, but he's had significant influence and made some terrible decisions for the people who have the power. So, let's see him actually try and do it. Mm-hmm. And that seat is Conservative through and through. It was Conservative in 97, so it's still going to be Conservative. He will win that seat. Let's see what he gets up to.
Sorry, West Sussex. Also joining us is Times reporter Geri Scott. Hi, Geri.
Hello.
So we've got another by-election coming up.
Isn't it exciting?
This one, they're all exciting. This one's in Rutherglen and Hamilton West after the SNP's Margaret Ferrier was recalled for breaking COVID rules back in 2020. I don't think she's essentially done any MPing since 2020 as a result of this. Is this a chance for Labour to prove that it's back in Scotland? She led Labour by 10 percentage points in 2019, but it's, a lot has changed.
Yeah, well, look, let's not judge any MPs for not doing any MPing. There are plenty of current MPs who aren't doing much MPing. Nadine Dorries. But look, I think I got sent to all of the by-elections that we've just seen for colour pieces for the Times, and hopefully I'm not going to be sent to Scotland, not because I don't love Scotland, but because I do need some sleep at some point. But I think what is interesting about the slew of by-elections we've just had, and then again this one, is that Starmer needs to be able to prove that he can win in a variety of seats, right? So whether that's Uxbridge, which obviously they didn't win but did make inroads in as kind of an outer London seat, whether it's the more blue wallish and then Scotland, he needs to be able to prove that he can form an electoral coalition across a vast number of seats if he's going to have a strong majority. And look, I think Scottish Labour hasn't been in the best place for a few years. Kind of insiders have said about the organisation not being brilliant, so I think they'll probably need quite a lot of support from the centre. But you're completely right that essentially they need to be able to prove that they can win in these seats ahead of any general election next year.
Our guest this week is popular with Rishi Sunak because his name is an anagram for Dugmore Oil. He's the head of news and politics at Joe Media and the host of the show Pubcast. And you've already guessed that it's Oli Dugmore. Hello. Welcome back.
Cheers, Dorian. How are you?
Good. You were with us, or not with us, back in lockdown. And now you're here in a physical sense.
It's nice to be this close to everyone.
On Tuesday night, Donald Trump was indicted on 4 counts for his attempts to overturn the 2020 election result leading up to January 6. But the BBC, there's quite a chilling sentence from the BBC. Mr. Trump, who now faces 78 criminal counts overall in 3 different cases, is currently the frontrunner in the Republican Party's contest to pick its next presidential candidate. Are the Republicans just in the election overturning business now?
Yeah, I'd say they were. If you want to look at the sort of most prominent politicians go to Congress, look at the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. He's denied that Joe Biden won the election. The majority leader there, Steve Scalise, he also has denied it. So senior politicians, yeah, they're in the election overturning business. Then Republican voters, I think the most recent polling puts it's more than a majority. I think it's about 60%. Numbers are coming down as time progresses, but still it's a majority of them. And again, if you look at the American population as a whole, it's about a third believe that the election was won fraudulently. So I think you can say quite unequivocally, yeah, it is in the election overturning business.
And also his opponents are terrible. And there was some excitement, wasn't there, around the midterms about Ron DeSantis. I mean, he was awful in his own special way, but he's also awful and unpopular. Like, he's just... It's unbelievable how bad he is at this.
It's quite surprising that they haven't found a viable candidate that isn't Donald Trump. You know, his shadow extends well past 2020. He's left an indelible mark on American politics. There's no doubt about that. Still the second most popular, if you're talking raw votes, American presidential candidate ever. You know, second to Joe Biden, but still there's no one else who's got close to him in that level of turnout. So who's coming next? I don't think there's anyone that can challenge him, certainly that I'm aware of in the Republican Party right now.
Yeah, well, it just goes to show that the American dream means that you can do many, many, many crimes and still become president.
Serve from the rectangle office, yeah.
During last summer's Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak managed to come across as the semi-reasonable one, sandwiched between Thatcherite headbanger Liz Truss and Walking Telegraph column Kemi Badenoch. The consensus then was that he'd been forced into putting pseudo nightmare Suella Braverman in the Home Office. But some commentators have been saying for a while that he's far more right-wing than he appears. A social conservative, a hardline Brexiter, and a Nigel Lawson superfan. The Economist recently called him the most right-wing Conservative leader of his generation and the most right-wing PM since Thatcher. Yet, it adds, neither voters nor his colleagues seem to have noticed. Now, Geri, as a journalist, you know that, of course, it's a great tactic to say that nobody else has noticed the thing that you're writing in your column. How true is it that pundits have misread his true nature, at least, you know, when he was running for leader?
I think it is true to an extent, but I think you do have to look at the context, right? And you mentioned it a bit there, that he was more moderate than Truss, but, you know, the Everton window has moved in such a direction that we're now all operating in a completely different sphere than we used to. I think some of this is also the image that Rishi Sunak has created for himself. His, you know, flashy adverts, putting his own signature on things, the swish photos in his slimline grey hoodie that makes him look a bit like a tech bro, his expensive coffee cups, his love of Peloton. Really, you can't say that he hasn't done well at building an image, but what lies behind that is arguably very different. And I think if you take some of his positions on cultural issues, very recently you can see that he's not worried about getting dragged into the culture wars. He has previously said, you know, I don't want to do that, I'm above that. But actually, in the steps that he's taking, you can see that he is happy. If you look at the trans guidance for schools, for example, that has been delayed, the chat is that that's been pushed back again because Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, is too soft for Rishi Sunak's liking. So, you know, there are really key issues where you see that he is potentially more right-wing than people might have first expected. So, yeah, look, I think he's also in a bit of a tricky position, and this isn't me giving him sympathy, but the reality of it, where he's got a party that is like wildly divided, right? So he's always trying to play to be a man of all things for all people, which does kind of mean that you never really know who he is. And for a prime minister who is trying to trade on so much authenticity, that's not necessarily a good place to be in.
So I want to unpack a bit why the optics have been so misleading. Because weirdly, in that leadership race, he came off as the Remainer to Truss's Leaver, even though they voted in the opposite way in 2016. So one thing I thought maybe that the very popular furlough scheme, which he personally hated, but he was responsible for. So was that like where a lot of people, I suppose I'm here talking about voters rather than commentators, where a lot of people actually kind of first saw him and thought, oh, he just seems like a guy who's quite happy to give people money when they're in need, and that sort of helped set up this fallacy.
Yeah, that's right. And look, so I actually used to work for the Eastern Daily Press in Norfolk many years ago. Liz Truss is, of course, a Norfolk MP. And I remember going out during the referendum and seeing her on those Remain stands in, Kings Lynn town centre, the glamorous life of a local journalist, I know. So I distinctly remember that. But doesn't it quite say something about how you can, revise history in politics, that she was able to then set herself up as, this arch-leave figure? But it also, as we've just said, works in the opposite way, that your opponents can paint you quite easily as something that might not be so politically advantageous in the future. I think for Rishi Sunak, you are right that his first introduction to the public as such was during the pandemic, and he stood at that podium and made a good impression. But political reality then often hits, right? You can't forever be the bloke that's giving away cash. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now, as well as him being the one that's actually in charge now. There was stories upon stories of the fact that him and Boris Johnson didn't always get on, that they were butting heads over things. But actually now, when it's him with his hands on the lever and making decisions and being responsible for everything, people are quite reasonably going to go, oh, no thanks. I mean, it's quite interesting. There was some research from the think tank Onward a few weeks ago about his popularity with millennials, and how actually with millennials he is still quite popular. I mean, look, all of this is relative. The Tories doing horribly in the ratings. Obviously, we're talking from a very low bar, but he's still pretty popular. But how long that can remain is to be seen. But it's not easy.
Is this because he sort of projects the vibe of somebody that's sort of got who's sort of set up with his university mate a kind of company that makes wackily marketed vegan burgers? He's
a tech bro, right? That's the image he gives off.
It's kind of it's very like, hey guys, youth must surely play into this quite a lot.
Yeah, and if you listen to him in interviews, it's fascinating because his kind of way of speaking is very kind of Californian. Obviously, he did spend a lot of time in America, and I do think that, as with a lot of men of a certain age, no offence to any listeners, they maybe think they're a bit cooler than they actually are. But he's, like I was saying, he's done a lot on his image to kind of work with that and try and look like he may be, one of the gang, someone you might find in a trendy coffee shop. But that's not exactly where his politics may be.
And of course, we've now found out that loads of tech bros are actually wildly right-wing. So I don't know why that was ever an association with being liberal. So Oli, Sunak's trick seems to be, he sort of comes across as fantastically sort of insincere and sort of glib and slick. Is he secretly a conviction politician who really does actually want to do all the things that he's doing, and he benefits from perhaps the misapprehension that he sort of has to do some of this stuff to keep the nutter backbenchers on side?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't think he's being forced to do any of this stuff against his will. I think in terms of the Conservative Party, he's largely unimpeachable at this point because they're not going to put themselves through another leadership election before the next general election. It would just be insane. Two already is probably enough. So I think you sort of, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. I think the policies that he's pursuing are either because he thinks they are to the benefit of the country, reducing inflation. I think you'd have to struggle to argue that wasn't to our benefit, or in efforts to win the next general election. So maybe you could lump small boats into that as well. But I think that's connected to the fact that he is actually, as we've been discussing, an incredibly right-wing bloke.
Jessica Elgott for The Guardian wrote a good piece back in April talking about this idea that always having his arm twisted. And then she went, far from being convenient red meat to the Tory members in the leadership election, his views on social issues such as gender, drugs, crime and migration are deeply conservative. How much do we know about his cultural values or even his background? I mean, are there things that we should have known, or are we learning as for example, he decides, he adopts certain causes and seems very passionate about things that maybe you didn't expect him to.
I don't necessarily think maybe things that we should have known, because as has been said already, he rose to prominence. It was extraordinary, really, how fast he got into one of the 4 great offices of state. And national crisis, very interventionist, paying 80% of the wages, with the support of the TUC and other trade unions. He then obviously gets out of that, and his policy programme is surprisingly different to that. But I remember the Jess Elgott piece, when it came out, I was really impressed by it. And there was another one during the Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak leadership election, written by Janan Ganesh, and shock, it was incredibly good. And it talks about the politics of vibes. It was, for all the things that we've discussed already, if you actually look at the evidence, Rishi Sunak committed Brexit, the only sincere Brexiteer Prime Minister we've had since the referendum, actually. Yeah. A city bro. And again, I'll shock you, the city is not a den of communism. I
thought it was all woke now.
Yeah,
it
is.
It was all woke.
Exactly, yeah. Woke traders, woke hedge funds. And you stack up Liz Truss's background. And actually, but because Rishi is young, he's from an ethnic minority, I think the vibe within Britain is, so he must be politically liberal. But in actual fact, his politics are they're really to the right. And the Elgott piece documents it, banning laughing gas, the stuff on trans rights. His Migration Act is far more punitive than, it's to the point where Theresa May is complaining about it, the creator of the hostile environment. So, yeah, I think he is incredibly right-wing.
Liz Truss, remember, started out as a free the weed Lib Dem.
Too right. Liz Truss, 420 Blazer, yeah.
One thing he seems very dishonest about is the environment. And a colleague, Alexandre, dug up an interview during the leadership contest where he earnestly said that his young daughters asked him all the time what he would do about the environment. I've probably got an awkward conversation now. His answer appears to be, fuck it. Is this anti-Labour in this sort of post-Uxbridge strategy way, or anti-planet? Is it just that, I just wonder how much is sort of political strategy and how much is, like, as Zach Goldsmith suggested, he couldn't care less. Yeah,
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's probably slightly excessive to suggest that Rishi Sunak is burning the planet simply to own the Libs. I think that's quite an extreme, quite an extreme policy position to take.
To own his kids.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But equally, I think you're talking about a gold medal in mental gymnastics if you think that burning more fossil fuels is going to help us reduce climate change and reduce global warming. Yes, I take your point though. It's a wedge issue. As Labour moves further to the right, they're squeezing the Tories, and the Tories obviously they're going to move further away from the centre as a result. So things like North Sea oil and gas or trans rights, actually in a lot of these cases, the Labour Party is squeezing their space on this, and they're having to find points of difference and wedge issues so that voters can see the difference between the two of them.
Anna, just as Rishi Sunak benefited from standing next to Truss or Badenoch, is Braverman's real value to Sunak is that she makes him look nicer? And because she could stand next to anybody, alive or dead, and make them look nicer. So maybe that was the idea, that you just need like a hard nut, and so you just look like you're just like, what can I do? She's just crazy on this stuff.
I think it's not just about the policies, it's about the presentation. The vibes, as we've been talking about, comes back to those optics. So Sunak channels the whole Blairite thing really well. He starts his sentences with "look" and all of that, and he comes across as the reasonable bloke in a suit, the kind of the centrist, even though he's not ideologically. And Braverman's not like that. She's very honest about who she is. She stands up and she says, says it like it is, and all of that. The stuff that the real Tory heartland love, that talking truth to these youngsters who on their avocado and toast and all of that, they absolutely love that. So it makes him look more reasonable next to her in that way, even though, as you say, they share an ideology, they share a view especially about immigration, about how we deal with migrants and small boats. So I don't think it makes him look nicer, but I think it makes him look calm, which is not a useless thing when you're standing general election.
Well, another point people made, I suppose, on this sort of vibes thing, I think maybe this was in the Economist piece, was saying that the fact that he appeared competent, was confused with centrism. Now,
Yeah, that's in
you
itself
can, of course, be an incompetent centrist.
Of course.
But those two things have got nothing to do with each other.
No, but they have been lumped together in people's minds because of this idea, which I actually am really obsessed with, about pragmatism, because pragmatism is largely lost from politics at the moment. And I'm on a bit of a personal cruise. I get written off as a terrible centrist mum all the time on Twitter. I'm kind of okay with that, because I do think pragmatism's lost, and what we end up with is, often, bluntly, a load of blokes shouting at each other. And he doesn't come across like that, even though he holds exactly the same views as some of the most radical right-wing aggressors on social media and so on. So, yeah, it is confused. They're not the same thing, but there's something about that calmness, that suit wearing, and the look. Look, if we just all sit down and speak a little bit more like we're on Newsnight, maybe we can come to a consensus. That's what he's doing. It works. And that's why he does it.
Because that
works.
thing that, sometimes people go, well, you can't be an authoritarian unless you're doing unless you sound a bit Nuremberg. The authoritarians shout a lot.
Absolutely,
and it's like all an authoritarians do
yeah.
is come along and seem quite reasonable, but do the same
thing.
thing.
But the thing is, it helps Sunak right now that Trump is standing again in the US, and that we've had the whole thing with Bolsonaro in Brazil, because it makes it look like he's so different from them just because of the way he addresses the people. Do
you think that maybe we're quite, there is a problem in the way that we talk about left, right, centre? There are multiple axes left and right. So like Truss was very, very conservative economically. I wouldn't say she was like extremely progressive socially, but that didn't seem to be her main. She didn't seem like really socially right wing. She didn't seem that arsed, because as long as she could just like fuck the economy, she seemed to a little more live and let live in other areas. And so that when we talk about kind of who's the most left wing and who's the most right wing and who's the centrist or whatever, are we kind of just using these terms too crudely, and therefore you do end up in these misunderstandings of where someone's actually coming from?
Yeah, I think that's very true. But I also think there's something else, which is that if you look at the data, that these terms are becoming totally outdated, because Gen Z are becoming more socially liberal about things such as LGBT rights, but they're personally making very conservative decisions about things like drug use and sex outside committed relationships and so on. And then they are very united as well on things that we used to consider liberal, like the climate. But actually the climate isn't a liberal agenda anymore. It's simply a major facet of modern politics, global politics. So, and that's a bit beyond political division. So everything's shifting around. I don't think the terms that we're used to speaking in about right, left, centrism are quite what they once were, and we need to look again at them.
Well, I wonder whether one reason why Corbyn inspired such strong emotions is because he was like obviously left wing,
or like the last
in a way that you could grow, in a way that if you'd grown up, it was like, oh, this is what left wing people were like in the 80s. And like he dressed like that and he spoke like that, and those were his
friends
values.
with those people too.
And it was very kind of like you didn't have to sort of acknowledge sort of how politics had changed. He was like, no, this is definitely left wing. Whereas a lot of the people, and you get this in I think the sort of commentator sphere as well, where it bleeds all over the place, and there are people who swear to me that Russell Brand is left wing, even though he sounds a lot like Tucker Carlson on certain issues. So we are in this very confusing phase, and maybe it's actually quite refreshing whether you've got a Corbyn or a Truss, and you just go, oh, I know what they are.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the thing about how identities are moving is that there's some research that suggests that Generation Z conservatives aren't into kind of this neocon economic liberalism anymore. They're much more into kind of protectionism, nationalism, and that sort of approach. So conservatism, as we think of it, that Truss type economic conservatism, seems to be less about what the future of conservatism will be. So everything's moving. Maybe we need some new terms so that we can shake it off.
I asked my daughter about if there are any Gen Z conservatives at school. She identified about 2 who have a pretty rough time of it. So
sure.
I don't have much of a kind of study group. I'm sure they're out there, but it's sort of I've yet to meet one.
We can't see them at the moment because the government are failing so badly. It's hard to know who would attach themselves to this government. Nobody. So we'll see how it all shakes out.
Geri, Truss had a very small but passionate fan base, and lots of backers in the think tank world. Who are the Sunakites? Who are his guys?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I remember writing a piece during the leadership elections, multiple. I may have written the same piece twice about the tribes and the Tory party, right? And I remember at the time separating out the Sunakites from the culture war type people, you know, and Boris Johnson backers and things like that. I'm not sure they're necessarily separate groups anymore, and I think basically what we're seeing is as it strides towards the election, more and more people are, one, having to find themselves fall behind Sunak, but also finding it easier to, because so many policies are being junked, right? You know, when we get a King's speech later on this year, I'll be amazed if, you know, you don't see, you know, that classic phrase, barnacles off the boat, of various policies that could have been a problem for Sunak with his party gone. You know, this isn't a kind of a scoop or anything, but I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if the conversion therapy bill is thrown overboard, because he just doesn't seem to want to engage in that. And I think by focusing on really kind of, you know, retail election issues, he'll find a lot more people becoming Sunakites. But look, traditionally, you're talking people like Mark Harper, your Mel Strides, your kind of more One Nation conservatives who would have backed him. But frankly, I don't think the Tories have any choice but to be a Sunakite at the moment.
Right.
Because who else have they got?
Because that was what was confusing back in the leadership race, like when Tom Tugendhat dropped out. And it's like his people, who were the kind of remaining centrists in the Tory party, they went for Sunak. Well, the trust. So it seemed as if like, oh, well, these are kind of Sunakites, but is it just basically expediency?
Yeah, I think it's complete expediency, because you might have suspected that those people who backed on Tugendhat, for example, might have rode in behind Penny Mordaunt, and some of them would have been right. But I think that, again, political realism hits, and it hits hard and it hits fast, and that's what we're seeing. I mean, look, I spoke about the King's speech there. This government is going to have, what's the latest, that we're looking at about a year until a general election. That's really not much time to do anything at all. I think the problem that Sunak's going to have with taking people with him within his party in the next year is going to be that he's not very good on the detail, right? So we've heard him in recent days, he speaks in averages when people want specifics. And it's that stuff we were saying about, you know, starting sentences with look and guys and things like that. And I mean, there was a bloke on a radio call in that he's done who said, oh, my mortgage has gone up from £1,500 to 2,000 and something pounds. And he went, well, actually, the average mortgages have only gone up from £800 to £1,000. Like, great, thanks.
How does that?
Maybe you should have an average mortgage.
Way better. And I think that's something that he's going to struggle with, and where you might then see kind of chinks in the armour, his own party saying, oh, I'm not sure about this guy. But again, it all comes down to the fact, like Oli said earlier, they ain't having another leadership election.
To wrap up, I saw somebody arguing that, you know, that the misunderstandings are really helping him, and that if more people knew how socially conservative he was, for example, then that would be a problem in sort of blue wall areas. So do you think he's actively, because even though obviously if you study his policy, it's not like he's not getting into this culture war stuff, but is he sort of actively aware that perhaps if you let Rishi be Rishi and people could really understand who he was, that actually would not help?
Yeah, I think possibly. You know, if we're talking your sort of home counties, fairly significant Remain vote, more socially liberal, your sort of Cameroon, One Nation type Tories, then talk about an Isha maybe, or, you know, Surrey, somewhere like that, then yes, possibly. I think in other Conservative seats, I think the Conservative membership certainly, and, you know, people who are on sort of the right of the Electoral coalition, they probably actually quite like some of the stuff he's saying. It depends how much of that the left side of the Tory coalition goes Lib Dem, goes Labour, or, you know, whoever's in second place, as we see an increase in tactical voting. But also, additionally, you know, both of the major parties, the Tories and Labour, they're forging new electoral coalitions. The political map is changing, and in the same way that perhaps, you know, that red wall is no longer red, the blue wall might also no longer be blue, and we see that redrawing of the map quite possibly sort of along demographic and also EU referendum lines.
So should Starmer be making more of this, or is this too left wing an opinion? Because a lot of people sort of seem to think optics-wise, there's not much to choose between them, and they're both these quite sort of bland, technocratic chaps in their image. But there obviously are big differences on the environment, on some cultural issues. So I might think, oh, well, this is a good way to say, well, this is why you should vote Labour, because look at this guy and look at these right-wing opinions he has. But then you were actually saying that perhaps Labour's thing was almost weirdly to not emphasise the difference and go, oh no, we're pretty right-wing as well, but we're just new.
Yeah, without sounding like too much of an incel and quoting Sun Tzu, I think
the way of the sword.
Yeah, exactly. Don't interrupt your opponent when they're making a mistake. I think it is incredibly hard for the Labour Party to win elections, and when the Conservative Party is doing as badly as it is, when you have this lead in the polls, don't fuck with it too much. I know the analogy that sort of people in and around Starmer use is the Ming vase, right, on the ice rink or whatever, and not wanting to drop it. So I think there's a degree of caution there, and not wanting to sort of start coming out swinging and fighting too hard on these cultural war issues. But on some of these issues, there are similarities there as well. We've been talking about self-ID. Starmer flip-flopped on that last week. He's adopted that sort of more aggressive, a woman is an adult human female language on the environment. If we wanted to talk about North Sea oil and gas, last month he said that the Labour Party would not revert any of the new licences, the explorative licences that are granted. So, yeah, I know there are differences, and it's unfair to paint them as the same, nationalised energy provider being one, and whilst the financial side of it has been watered down, a lot of money is going towards this sort of Green New Deal type policy. And then ULEZ, which, he offered Sadiq Khan the glowing endorsement of saying he had no other option, which is the sort of thing that a vet says when he's come out after putting your dog down.
Well, we're going to get onto this in the next bit. Is
Nice.
Poor old Sadiq Khan.
Yeah.
It's just like, I've got this cool idea. And someone's like, no, mate.
No.
No.
Nice try.
No. I'm gonna slag it off in public. Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. Ronald Reed asks, the anti-LTN, low traffic neighbourhood, ULEZ movement is astroturfed. How does Sunak get conned into a policy direction by minority activists, many of whom don't exist? Hannah, is Sunak being conned? I'm questioning the premise of this question.
I'm questioning it too. No, it's not a con. This is what people in the Tory heartlands, and in the Labour constituencies that could swing, that need to go back to Tories, they really genuinely do not like the LTNs or the whole ULEZ concept. Now, I don't think they often fully understand it. I'm not being patronising. There's not been good information about this in the press at all. I think, hands up, my industry has not been good at communicating exactly what LTNs are, what the purpose of them is, how successful they are when you look at the data.
I've read online that they're related to the pandemic. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. How we're all going to live, how 15-minute neighbourhoods, which amusingly started as a really technocratic local government nerd thing about how to have better neighbourhoods where everyone lives a nicer life, have become turned into this bizarre conspiracy theory about how nobody's going to be able to leave. There's going to be a fence around your home 15 minutes away, which is obviously complete nonsense. And it's amusing to me to watch local government terminology get turned into something like this. It just proves that it's a deep problem there about how policy is communicated. So it's been a good case study in that. No, it's not a con. These are activists who are deeply within the Conservative Party. And frankly, it does play to Conservative ideals, that people should be free to spend their money on what they want in terms of a car. They shouldn't be fined directly for using their own transport, that they should have choice. That choice shouldn't be taken away from them. So I'm not surprised at all that Sunak is in this position. It's the Starmer issue that we just touched on that is the problem.
Joe, you said that you'd been to Uxbridge, right? So was that he's sort of alleging that it's astroturfed, and of course with all this stuff, there's a lot of various lobby groups and think tanks involved. Did you get a feeling that there was a big grassroots rebellion against ULEZ, that there was something genuine there?
No, and look, maybe this is a unpopular opinion, but people were genuinely concerned. I had to do the dreaded vox popping. Stood on the high street, spoke to people. What I must say is that the first thing I did is I interviewed Danny Beales, who was the Labour candidate in Uxbridge. And one of the first questions I asked him is, so, ULEZ, Tories are going hard on it. Is it a problem? And he went, no one's talking to me about it. That's aged well. And then the first person I went out and spoke to on the street said, ULEZ is going to absolutely kill me. It's £12.50 a day. It's a lot of money. And it is a lot of money. I don't think you can deny it's a lot of money. But I completely agree with Hannah that basically it hasn't been explained or sold very well. And I don't think it's some, big ploy to kind of do it down. I think people are genuinely concerned in a time where there's a cost of living crisis, and especially in outer London, a lot of people still rely on their cars, right? So I live in zone 3, I don't need a car, but if I lived out in zone 5, I probably would. So I think it's that. I think what is interesting about Sunak and Starmer and their approach to ULEZ in particular going into a general election is Labour did not seem prepared with a line on ULEZ going into Uxbridge. I think it seemed like they were shocked that it was even coming up, which I think is pretty strategically naive, frankly. That you have to make the case, you have to make the positive case for things, and they weren't able to do that until it was too late. And I think unless they sort out their line, particularly on ULEZ, but then on wider environmental issues, there's a risk that you see that play out at a general election in other London constituencies. I think there's a real world where we wake up the day after a general election next year, and if they haven't sorted this out, that essentially Labour have made massive gains all around the country. They've still probably got a majority, let's be honest. It's not going to cost them an election. But you look at London, and quite a few of those red seats have gone blue. If they don't sort out essentially their line on it. You can't have a run up to an election with Steve Khan on one hand and Keir Starmer on the other hand saying something completely different. So I completely agree. I don't think Sunak's been conned into it. I think he sees an opportunity. That's why he's going for it.
The weird thing is the line is so simple. Most people who think they're going to be affected won't. Yeah. So if Labour just stood up and said, the Tories are making a big meal out of this, if you think you're going to be affected, here's what you really need to know. You probably aren't. That's all they need to do. Completely. It's remarkable that wasn't happening.
Oli, do you think this will be something like an important issue over the next year? Because obviously by-elections are wildly overinterpreted. And so everybody was talking about it was ULEZ mania after Uxbridge. But that was a very specific seat, and it was actually a very specifically kind of narrow result. Do you think it is going to be problematic in other seats? Or has Labour just kind of panicked on this?
So for me, it's quite simple to explain the result in Uxbridge, and it's that 20,000 Brunel students were on their summer holidays when voting happened. So that right there is a ginormous Labour constituency right there. I think a lot of people, for political purposes, were making it about ULEZ. Not just the Tories, by the way, people in the leader's office in Labour as well, because there's a proxy war going on between them and City Hall. The facts around ULEZ are half of Londoners don't own a car. The World Health Organization, I personally find this a little hyperbolic, but the World Health Organization has said that air pollution is more dangerous than tobacco to people in the modern age. It's interesting. Geri mentioned that chap, right, who said ULEZ is killing me. Well, I'll tell you what will kill him: nitrogen dioxide,
absolutely, yeah.
Which causes chronic lung health. And I think the messaging around this, I understand the anger here, because it's about 80% of every journey in Britain is taken in a car. So cars are very important to people, and rightly so. You should be able to drive one. But equally, if we don't ask people to pay for these things, then effectively what we're doing is subsidising their driving with our lung health. Because take for example the fevered and frenzied debate around e-scooters, right, which do not kill that many people. Compared to cars, they do not kill that many people. Cars do it by a number of ways: air pollution, road traffic collisions, and we behave as if it's people's God-given right to drive these things to the detriment of other people in society. I think we should design cities that that aren't so reliant on motor traffic, that are pedestrianised, have adequate public transport, because that's the other half of the conversation, right? The reason why people are reliant on their cars is because if it was cheaper, easier, and a nicer experience to get a bus or a train to the place you were going to, I bet 9 people out of 10 would take it instead of driving. So I understand the anger, but also we do have to have a little bit of perspective that it's not your God-given right to drive a car.
Well, Lord Frost would disagree with
I'm
you.
sure he would.
Cars, he says, are synonymous with freedom, and the public transport
Yeah,
is
yeah.
akin to servitude. Well, more city talk as we talk about rents spiralling in the UK as the market for properties becomes smaller and more static. New lets are 25% more expensive than before COVID. 1 in 3 renters spend half their take-home pay on rent. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan wants the power to freeze rents for 2 years, but Lisa Nandy seemed to abandon the idea of rent controls in June. Andy Burnham in the Labour left are also strongly in favour. A person and a group guaranteed to win over the leadership office. Putting Labour squabbling aside, that feels good. Let's take a quick look at the policy itself. We're going to probably have to do, because we're probably going to do quite a short, tight one on this.
Okay.
Hannah, you are a housing expert. Neil Garrett, the Tory leader in the London Assembly, said recently, the problem with it, like so many other populist political ideas, is it doesn't work. Pause to reflect on a Tory denouncing populist ideas that don't work. It restricts the supply and ultimately makes the problem worse. Everywhere where it has been tried, it doesn't work. That sounds very simple, Neil. Is that true?
Sadly, yes. Unfortunately. I know you probably weren't expecting that from the housing desk, but it is true. And this is one thing that I fully disagree with Andy Burnham on. Normally usually agree quite closely with Andy Burnham where he stands. It doesn't work. It benefits sitting tenants. So if you're a sitting tenant right now, I totally understand why, if you're listening to this, you'd think, of course we need rent control, of course we need a cap. The problem is it's at the expense of any new tenant. And this is a growing sector all the time. We're now at the point where actually I saw some fantastic new data today shared with me by Alex, in fact, who'd spotted it, that we now have a higher percentage of the British population who are renters than own their home with a mortgage. That's not happened for a very long time. So really interesting period of time. But when you've got a growing sector like that, you need to make sure that there is supply. The biggest problem at the moment that we have is supply. Landlords are leaving the market rapidly for a number of reasons. One of them is to do with the cost of mortgages at the moment. Another one is to do with the very, very important and absolutely right legislation that's coming up around improving the quality of private rented housing. But what you end up is, the market shrinks, the demand increases, the worst bits of it get worse. The people who are sitting tenants in good properties get to hold on to it at the expense of the poorest people with the least opportunity. It's a bad idea.
So is it because it's in used in quite a lot of American cities?
It is, yeah.
I knew about it in New York because people said, how can Monica afford that flat in Friends?
Yeah.
She clearly explains in one episode that it's rent controlled and she got it somewhat semi-legally from her grandmother. So it's in New York. I think it's in San Francisco. So is this exactly what's happening in those places?
Yes, to an extent. So in New York and San Francisco, which, as you say, are the best sort of known examples, they have definitely got this separation in the market where there's a 2-tier system. So there's basically a 2-tier private rented sector. Half of it is fucking awful, really, really, really bad quality, and that's where the most vulnerable people end up, and half of it's quite nice and basically occupied by middle class people. And the Monica and Friends example is pretty interesting because it's been tried in Sweden, and in Sweden there's a great example of the problem with it is that it's actually become a kind of middle class hidden market that keeps itself to itself. So when someone wants to leave their rent control property because they're going to buy or they move to the next life stage, it ends up getting passed on to someone they know, whether it's a child or a godchild or somebody or a friend who wants to rent, and so it gets moved around within those who know, and those who are immigrants, those who are otherwise disenfranchised, just are not connected to those networks, have no opportunity to access those properties. So it makes the poorest poorer, and it's exploitative as well. So it's not a solution. What is a solution, though, is rent rise capping. But I think both parties, I might be corrected, but definitely Labour are committed to some kind of controlling of the rising.
Could you explain the difference between rent controls and controlling the rising of the rents?
Yes. So rent controls set the price at which you can market a property at, and mean that there's a ceiling. Rent rise capping means that you can let your property out for whatever you want. The market demands it. If you're a new landlord, you can put it out there and see what you can get, but then you can only rise it by a certain percentage each year. So you can't basically just evict a tenant and then put a 30% rise on for the next tenant.
So, Oli, how do you feel about what is the solution to what is in itself? I mean, you're talking about, Hannah's talking about the social consequences, perhaps, of rent controls. But the social consequences of rising rents are very obvious in terms of forcing people out, fracturing communities, giving people these insanely long commutes, or even making it them incapable of working certain jobs. So what, if you come across that seems like a better solution, or are you actually a rent control guy? We're allowed to disagree on it.
I'm not a rent control guy. To coin a phrase, I think it's a sticking plaster. Even though I absolutely hate that
I'm in a
phrase.
room of Nantiites.
I wouldn't go that far. If you have a supply and demand problem, the solution is not to increase demand by making it cheaper, it's to build supply. So Centre for Cities estimates that in the UK we've had a shortfall of 4.3 million homes. So for me that means the next government for every year of the next parliament should be building 1 million homes a year. For the issues you've just touched on, there is enormous social good in providing people with affordable, good quality housing, whether it's educational outcomes, quality of life, reduced crime. It costs money to build these things, but the sort of broader societal effects, the aggregate effects as well of building them properly are absolutely enormous. And then, my pet interest as well is kind of local agrarianism. So for my money, at least 1 million of that 4.5 million should be sort of family-sized homes with enough land that people can agriculturally support themselves in the rest of the country. But that's a conversation for another day, I think. I suspect.
No, this is good. You should just send in about your emails and then we can discuss it under a pseudonym. Because landlords generally are quite unpopular. Joe went to a landlords conference at the end of last year, asked them what tenants could do to help with their bills, and it was very much like, go on fewer holidays, buy less coffee. But obviously mortgage rates are shooting up. So how much sympathy do you have for landlords at the moment?
I have sympathy for every human being, right? But
it's like Rishi Sunak being vague, isn't it? It's
exactly.
just like all of God's children, man.
Look, I'll say I don't think all landlords are bastards. Some are, some aren't. Some are good. It's funny that when mortgage rates start to rise, no one starts telling them to eat fewer avocados. They get political representation. They get conversations in Parliament about a mortgage bomb. What's the government going to do to intervene to protect the landlords? When private landlords are, it's wealth redistribution in completely the wrong direction. It's you have an asset and you're taking from the wage class to pay for your asset as part of the asset class. Look, in Austria they have, I think it's something like 60% of people live in public housing. I'm not against people renting. It's part of capitalism, right? You put your capital on the line, and the reason you get to make money is there's risk. And if you fall on the downside of the risk, well, I guess the landlords are at the sharp end of of our economic system, which the tenants have been suffering for the last few decades.
I mean, this is it, though. It's part of a much bigger issue. So this is why rent control doesn't really work as a policy, because it's part of a system where totally unequal distribution, as you've described, and where we've got something like a 61 to 1 ratio between CEO pay and average worker pay. It's all rooted in that. It's much bigger than just the housing crisis. So,
Geri, 87 MPs are landlords. Now, without wanting to be too conspiratorial about this, I mean, is that enough for it to be affecting policy? Are some people self-interest, certain kind of sympathy with landlords rather than renters? I don't know the numbers for MPs who are renting.
Yeah, look, I think, to be honest, I think the answer is basically no, simply because 87 MPs is not enough, to be, a majority of MPs or even a majority of Conservative MPs. It's less than
I would have thought,
right?
actually.
But I think the reason that it's probably seems like they might be overrepresented is, especially this current government, landlords are probably more likely to vote Tory. It's really as simple as that. And I think that essentially, who shouts the loudest in society? It's a tale as old as time, right? If you've got a landlord turning up to your surgery to tell you about how difficult things are for them, it might seem like a bit of an easier problem to solve than the person whose social housing you can't sort out, because it's kind of just a bit simpler, or you might kind of relate to them more if you're a Tory MP. I don't think it's necessarily because Tory MPs are landlords. It's interesting, isn't it? Kind of if you speak on a wider level of housing, that no one really seems to be happy with the Tory housing offer at the moment. I did a feature a few weeks ago on how a lot of major house builders are withdrawing their donations from the Conservatives because they're not happy about house building. So I just don't think really anyone is very pleased, to state the obvious. So no, look, I don't really think it has a massive impact because MPs are landlords. I think it's just electoral.
Because the flip side to that is electorally, if you're renting, you're more likely to vote Labour. Now, I've got a terrible habit, unfortunately, of naming government policies, and then it turns out those policies have been dropped. So I could be wrong about this, but Michael Gove, at some point in a renters reform bill, was talking about ending no-fault evictions, which of course is something that I think would have cross-party support. So is this the Gove exception? My favourite Robert Ludlum novel. Is this again just like, oh well, there's one guy, that he is sort of doing something for the renters. So is there an offer from the Tories?
Yeah, look. And I don't know how popular this is going to be on a podcast such as this. I think Michael Gove has his heart in the right place. But I do think that is true on this. And I think that he's proposed some stuff that within the Conservative Party could be seen as pretty radical, and wants to make some change. But, what you say there about not knowing if something is policy, the commitment has kind of been phased in and out. I think COVID really changed the game on this, and Eddie Hughes and his work on homelessness has been really influential on, I think, a lot of these reforms as well. But I think the fact is that bad landlords are always going to find a way to be bad landlords. So yeah, you might be able to get rid of no-fault evictions, but they will find another reason to kick people out. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, when the detail came out about the no-fault evictions, there was also something for landlords in there, but that was about kind of causing a nuisance, and that was quite vague. The wording was very vague about, you'll know better than me, Hannah, but about how kind of exactly they could make it a fault eviction. So, it's kind of giving with one hand, taking with another.
Can they make them give the deposit back unless you've totally fucked it up?
Do you know
that
what
would
I think?
be great. That would be great.
Unless it looks like a crack den, they have to give you deposit back. Because I remember one where it was just like, the fridge. There's a little smell in the fridge.
I must admit, and I as someone who has rented in London for the last 5 years and rented for many, many years before that, I have only ever had good experiences with the deposit protection scheme. I actually think that they're quite a good thing. But maybe that's because I am very lucky to not kind of, live in very rundown places where landlords are scam artists and things like that. But essentially, I think there is a balancing act here. I think Gove has probably taken it further than anyone else could have in that job in this current government.
Right.
Look, I'm not saying the situation is perfect, but...
It's all right, you've qualified your praise for Michael Gove suitably to avoid complaints. Ollie, finally, we're talking about the kind of electoral logic here. Do you see it already, perhaps, perhaps backfiring for the Tories in the sense that the sort of pesky Reds are being forced out of the city, and that it is turning some of those suburban seats more Labour? That that if you change the demographics, you change the vote. Yeah,
that's certainly happening. I think you're seeing that in those sort of the home counties, the constituencies that we mentioned earlier, and some of the local council elections. You start to see signs of that, but again, tactical voting's folded into it, so it's that you can't overanalyze it. Look, home ownership is an incredibly powerful political force. Ask Margaret Thatcher, but yeah, there are it's a way to win votes. It's a way to be popular. People want secure housing, and if you provide it to them, they will vote for you. So if you want to be a complete cynic about it, yeah, if either of the parties adopted a radical house building program, I think they'd feel the benefit of a lot of electoral success as a result.
It would be fun if you did the right thing that actually helped people and it was electorally beneficial.
Yeah,
that seems really good. Yeah, for sure. We've reached the end of the show, so we'll quickly talk about the stories that have gone under the radar this week. Hannah.
So this is some interesting data from Dementia UK, which it was reported by The Guardian, but it did get a bit buried by the big BBC investigation into the social care crisis this week, which basically shows that calls to their helpline from people who are caring for relatives, friends with dementia, particularly Alzheimer's, where they're reporting being in immediate danger, physical danger from the person they're caring for, have doubled in 2022. There's now more than 3 calls a week where the person is basically at risk of physical harm. And I mean, that's just so heartbreaking. And there are now 700,000 people who are being looked after by their relatives or close friends with dementia. And it's a huge issue. And I think this kind of risk of physical threat is a really under-considered area of the care crisis. I mean, it's such a hard job, such hard work, and often work that's done by women in families who are taking on that care role in their mid to later life if they're supporting a much older parent or relative. And I think we don't do enough to support those people, and the fact that they're at physical risk is just a great example of that.
Geri.
Yeah, if you'll allow me to be a bit like introspective on this and indulge me a bit in a bit of journalism chat, there's a story that I think has got under the radar. It's about a group called NewsQuest, which listeners will have no idea who they are, but they own a lot of local newspapers around the country. It's a kind of this issue close to my heart. The NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, uncovered this week that NewsQuest appear to be basically retaining, they get money for a post that's called a BBC local democracy reporter job. Essentially, it's the BBC funding local democracy reporters for local papers in a bid to make up for the fact that the BBC essentially dominates the industry, right? They pay for them, but they work for the local papers. NewsQuest appears to be retaining per post around £10,000 of the funding they get from the BBC and only passing on the minimum amount they need to these local democracy reporters. I think it's a really, really important story because essentially it's taxpayers' money, right? The BBC is funded by all of us, and it's supposed to go towards people being able to effectively report on local councils, what your councils are doing and holding them to account. And I think it's just shoddy practice.
Is this under the radar because NewsQuest is not reporting it?
Well, exactly.
Oli?
We spoke a little bit about Labour Party rent controls, etc., but there was a really good piece in the Eye this week about the sort of internecine warfare between the Metro mayors and Keir Starmer and the leader's office, including a quote. There was a quote in this piece that just blew my mind, which was that Labour's leadership is absolutely furious with Sadiq Khan about free school meals. I think there's been, from a Labour insider, I think there's been a chronic lack of reporting broadly about the sort of the factionalism and the centralisation of power within the Labour Party. And I think it's a story that's going to grow and grow because Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan aren't going to go away, and equally the proclivity of Keir Starmer's leader's office is to centralise power, and he does not like those rival power bases.
I did a piece on mayors a year ago for The Guardian and spoke to a bunch of them, and the potential, what they wanted to do, and obviously there's, people do like having power, but it was quite sort of inspiring, the possibilities, the idea of experimenting with it and working. And they all talked about working with the central leadership, and I was really struck by, I haven't read the piece you mentioned, but I was really struck by how often they were just like smacking down people who, were trying out a lot of interesting policies, do have some personal popularity. It just seemed like they were like, no, thank you.
This is the question, right? Because Labour is the party of devolution,
right.
And let's not we can't ignore the sort of the Blairite tendencies of the current iteration of the Labour Party. It'll be very interesting if Starmer's iteration of it does not pursue devolution in the same way that Tony Blair's did.
I've just got a really quick one. There's a great sort of political analyst, freelance political analyst called Steve Akehurst on Twitter, who just dug up some really interesting stats on what policies people like and which ones they're willing to pay for, based on the fact that obviously a very easy argument against net zero is like, well, people would like not to have a climate crisis, but they don't want to pay for it. And then he found data that basically people don't want to pay for anything except the NHS. They don't want to make any personal sacrifice. And when it was like, would you like better schools? They go, yes. Would you make any financial sacrifice for better schools? No, God, no. And that this was the same on basically, like I said, everything except healthcare. And so that this was a really dishonest argument against green policies. And that's the show. Thank you so much to Hannah,
Thank you.
Geri,
Thank you.
and Oli.
Cheers.
Stay tuned for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and the traditional thank you to our generous supporters. You too could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.